Everyone, thanks for popping in and seeing what I'm doing. My name is Nikki B, and I'm glad you're here with me. Borderline personality disorder. Let's learn how we can control our emotions, anger, and depression if you suffer from this debilitating disorder. Let's continue now. This will probably be about 5 chapters, but they're very, very short ones. So let's dive in.
Chapter 6. Are adolescent boys and young men with borderline personality disorder being underdiagnosed? Is it because teens are not diagnosed with a personality disorder, such as a borderline personality disorder, that they are on the wrong road to lifelong marginalization and eventual criminalization? Borderline personality disorder, BPD, is more likely to be diagnosed in women than men, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. BPD is characterized by persistent trends of interpersonal relationship dysfunction, poor self-image, and mood dysregulation that begin in early young adulthood. Most people manifest behaviorally: 1. Frantic attempts to prevent real or imagined discontinuation. 2. Intense and unstable relationship patterns. And 3. Impulsive acts that harm or hurt themselves. Women diagnosed and treated with BPD often go to therapy to learn new coping strategies which help regulate their moods, improve communication, and strengthen their relationships. The prevalence of BPD in teenage boys and young men can be higher than most people responsible for their treatment and encouragement understood. BPD is less likely in adolescent boys and young adult men, and more generally identified as antisocial, hostile, defying, threatening, criminal, oppositional, hyperactive, or narcissistic. Undiagnosed teens are not adequately treated for BPD and can evolve into people with severe emotional and behavioral issues. Teenagers with BPD symptoms are often removed from school due to their issues with authority figures, their difficulty in dealing with laws, their resistance, unstable relationships, and aggressive behavior. Once these young men are neglected or rejected by the educational system, they are quickly broken up in society. They will end up in trouble, join gangs, face severe addiction, commit violence, and criminal acts. They are often unemployed and may end up behind bars. Parents who do not know about the debilitating personality disorder frequently fail to detect early warning signs. Parents frequently fail in assuming that their sons go through a stage in the expectation that they will quickly emerge from it, and then realize years later that they didn't grow out of it. You may have serious impulse control or addiction issues. And they can develop serious addictions to drugs and alcohol. Most suffer from a lack of training, employment, or safe and meaningful relationships. Most of them are brilliant and imaginative, but they often lack the ability to control their emotions and hinder their ability to succeed. We are likely to be quickly overcome by negative, self-defeating thoughts, emotions, and actions that weaken their confidence and ability to pursue tasks or objectives. Men with BPD tend to appear stuck in long-term patterns of behaviors that sabotage impulse management problems that lead to serious addictions and addiction behaviors. With such desire, long-term consequences for men living with BPD, more needs to be done to properly diagnose young men and adults at an early stage. If parents believe that their child can have BPD, it is crucial that they seek professional assistance in order to be diagnosed and treated medically. Early detection and care will improve a young man's life dramatically, stopping him from suffering without need. Evidence-based early life approaches may help most of these young men avoid rejection and struggle by giving them the ability to cope with their feelings, to express their desires, and to help them maintain meaningful relationships. 2 main clinical interventions based on evidence have consistently demonstrated positive results for BPD benefit diagnosed individuals: dialectical behavior therapy, DET, and mentalization-based therapy, MBT. The research has shown that working with a DBT or MBT trained therapist will bring about positive changes in young men with minimal personality disorders. Men of all ages will battle with specific personality disorders over time and live a more productive life. Chapter 7. Emotional Bullying in Borderline Personality Disorder. We usually consider bullies to be scary people. We don't think they can take the form of spiteful and little women. We have found that bullies come in both genders in high and grade school, even though we still regard them as physically intimidating and threatening males. There's actually a type of emotional bully that's much more dangerous and destructive than a physical bully. The physical bully is generally a person who has been abused by a bigger and stronger person as a child. You put the pain and anger to others who seem smaller and weaker. There are several effective ways I will deal with these forms here. The mental bully is another being. This person usually has a condition called BPD, or borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by various symptoms and signs. Those with milder conditions have extreme fears of rejection, persistent feelings of loneliness, and a tendency to repel those who want to love or support them. Those with a more serious and debilitating disorder suffer pervasive moods, self-destructive behavior, complex addiction, constant uncontrolled wrath, and intense touchiness. Such people are offended at things normally not considered to be a small thing, and they are quick to take revenge. If someone from the latter group has the misfortune of dealing with him, he knows to what degree this kind of person can fulfill his need for revenge. Paradoxically, these borderline people are the real ones in their quest for so-called truth, as opposed to the person who allegedly falsified them. This disorder was originally described by the term borderline because some of these people's ideas are so insane and some of their values so impossible and completely set that they seem almost psychotic. The disease is known to be at the verge of madness when it is serious. Those with a milder version of the condition can do counseling very well. You can work fairly well in your life, and you don't get too hard for yourself or anyone. More severely affected people tend to be disturbers who are self-mutilators and or who intervene destructively in the lives of others. We dislike each other, which is theoretically known as separating and cause a lot of pain in the people with whom we live and work. They are manipulative, passive, unreasonable, stubborn, unreasonable, and highly impulsive. They get under the skin of men. If you often discuss with your coworkers an unusually furious and irritated colleague or boss, this person is most likely to have borderline personality disorder. BPD people can be so filled with rage that they go to extreme lengths to punish people that they believe have been hurting them. This can take the form of legal threats, extortion attempts, bullying, and other forms of harassment. The so-called offenses to which they respond are almost always imaginary, but the wrathful and vengeful feelings of those troubled people are very real. Unfortunately, people with severe BPD are likely to keep escalating if they try to stand up for themselves. We view self-defense as an attack against them in their troubled mind. Often, the best way to deal with such a person is to avoid all interaction with him. This could include changing jobs, moving to a new home, or giving up any interests or activities. It seems like a drastic reaction, but hell has no wrath like a borderline scorned. Our tribunals are nowadays overwhelmed and actually are extremely weak in understanding and tackling the legal ramifications of mental disorders. Before the kind of bullying and harassment so characteristic of a very ill person in the BPD is covered legally, it is up to us to become less of a target to such people by taking us from their connections and hope that they will continue to pursue their upsetting and damaging agenda. Clearly, it doesn't mean that we should try to defend ourselves and protect ourselves from security and social threats, but that it is important to understand how individuals with BPD appear to be specialists in using the legal system for their negative benefit. With their misguided sense of revenge, they exploit the legal system and use any legitimate and illegitimate tools to get back at the people they have a grudge against. One comfort for the survivors could be to consider the profound unhappiness of people with severe BPD. They are unable to form natural, stable attachments to others, and constant tension and resentment characterize their ties. We are constantly annoyed and irritated, but they cannot relieve this discomfort. We are as self-destructive as we hurt others and are depressed, angry, and pointless. If we are depressed enough to have a relationship with someone with a serious case of BPD, we can note that whatever they made us feel, it was only temporary, but their unhappiness is never ending. We are afflicted by their fear, anger, and revenge. As much as I care about such people, I can't help but feel empathy for them, since one of the worst places in the world is within someone with extreme BPD's troubled mind. Chapter 8. Borderline Personality Disorder and Transference. Almost everybody with borderline personality disorder who takes part in therapy is aware of the transference phenomenon. Transference occurs when a person, usually the counselor, receives the desires, wishes, and feelings of the client. The types of transfers that the patient uses for therapy are often representative of problems that occurred during childhood and that remain unsolved. Sigmund Freud, the most well-known psychotherapist of all, has a tradition of transmission in one of his early seminal works, Hysteria. He viewed it as an extremely important element of psychoanalysis because it exposed the patient's hidden parts. He came to his theory when he knew that many deep and typically subconscious emotions were felt by many of his patients. While most people are sure to have transition problems on their way to a BPD recovery, not all. Practice transfer indicates no serious mistake with the person with borderline personality disorder. It is only a natural occurrence during the therapeutic process, and one should not be worried. A professional and well-trained psychologist should know how to deal with it. Different types of transfer. One of the most common types of transfer is maternal transmission. This occurs when your mother, a biological mother, or an adoptive mother has unresolved problems. This transition will cultivate feelings of ambivalence and wrath. Paternal transition happens when the client sees the therapist as a father. The patient may want advice and protection from the therapist, who is all strong and very knowledgeable. Often, the client experiences sibling transfer with the counselor when the relationships with parents are extremely poor or highly dysfunctional and often unhealthy with their children. Change is not only during counseling, but is more likely to take place in this environment. It can happen at a workplace when a person interacts with a coworker who can, for example, remind him of a sibling. The employee will allow this colleague extra leeway in terms of deadlines, as his sibling is always late and they have compassion with the sibling. Or a person could have had a spouse that was cheating them, and every subsequent relationship bears the stigma of the former, as impaired by the passing of anger and resentment to the former spouse. It is not always a positive or a neutral change. Negative as well as positive changes will improve the relational connection as long as the therapist manages it skillfully. How does transition affect the person with a borderline disorder? When not handled properly, the borderline personality disorder may lead the person to other forms of misadaptive conduct, such as cutting, substance use, or excessive shopping or gambling. These self-injurious behaviors can have devastating consequences. Transfer helps the therapist help his or her patient because it clarifies the issues to be tackled during therapy. Many psychologists see this as a way of recognizing the repressed feelings and latent thoughts and or fears of their clients. Once these concerns and or worries have been resolved, healing can begin. Transference should not be confused with projection. Projection is a growing method of security that many people use to cope with their emotions or feelings. An example would be a scenario in which you hate someone you just met almost instantaneously. This may be because you remember your aunt with whom you had a big argument recently. Another example of a screening is a person who suspects someone else of cheating because they are shopping. I firmly believe that the therapy itself does not cure the client. Rather, it is the patient's interaction with the psychologist which heals. This relationship is due to change. Chapter 9. Signs of Borderline Personality Disorder in Elderly and Women. Borderline disorder of the personality of the elderly. That person has its own character. Many people are introvert, some are extrovert, some very neurotic, and some are not. Personality in every person is unique since no two people are alike. Often, personality has certain characteristics that make it difficult for society to function properly. They also speak of personality disorders when this is the case. It is strange to say that you give every person a mini diagnosis when you are a psychologist. You don't do so deliberately. You instinctively look at each person you meet, how they are, and what characteristics they have. If you work in a kindergarten home, it will not work, as most people have certain characteristics that make it impossible to work. Many elderly people also have many illnesses. It makes diagnosing one person with only one illness very difficult. Although personality disorders in middle-aged people are very frequent, they are not so frequently diagnosed in children's homes. This is presumably because a doctor is more likely than someone else to look into a kidney dysfunction. There is, however, a form of personality disorder that is impossible to miss, and one is the borderline personality disorder. You can quickly identify a person with borderline personality disorder because these people are very good at subtly manipulating your attention. You know very well how to exploit you and others, and you get as much attention as you need. It is very difficult to cope with these conditions, as a borderline individual cannot sympathize with emotions of others. The best way to deal with borderline personality disorder is to give the person a great deal of structure. Tell me always what the rules are and let everybody adhere to the rules. A boundary will attempt to find the edge, and these limits should be clearly stated. The borderline personality disorder, BPD, is a very serious problem for women. The word borderline has been thrown around a lot in recent years, and it's crucial to always see a trained and licensed BPD psychologist before attempting to diagnose yourself or diagnose certain people that you know with this distressing disorder. A woman with minimal personality problems will usually have a dysfunctional and volatile vast majority of her relationships. Low self-esteem, regular outbursts of anger and frustration, and impulse behavior are a common subject in women's lives. Early in adulthood, all the symptoms of borderline personality disorder start in women. Common signs of this mental illness in women include anxiety that those they love or are abandoned, the fear of loss, even if it is not a real threat or even possibility, is a common theme in their lives. Women with this condition may tell a woman that they love her and not leave her, but the person with a BPD still maintains the perceived abandonment. A further indication of borderline personality disorder in females is that they are often dependent on others, often when paired with fears of rejection. Women have erratic behavior and often leave or end relationships before they can be abandoned. Usually, people diagnosed with such mental illness have at least 5 of the following symptoms of minimal personality disorder. BPD in women is the number 1 feature. She is making frenzied efforts to prevent real or imagined abandonment. Limit personality disorder feature number 2. People with this condition have a history of complicated relationships, with the common theme of those interactions being unpredictable emotional experiences of intense love, envy, or dislike of the individual in the relationship. Trait number 3. BPD women are often insecure in their own identities and uncertain about their own identity. Trait number 4. People with BPD tend to act impulsively in self-harming ways, which include spending, sex with several partners, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, slow driving, and binge eating. Women diagnosed with difficult illness often have a long-term feeling of emptiness and depression. Signs of borderline personality disorder in women feature number 6. They often have regular emotional disturbances and extreme mood changes, which can range from being down to the bowl and being nervous to feel happy and euphoric within a very short time. Such outbursts often only last for a couple of hours, but others can last for days. Trait number 7 is one to be watched for. Women with borderline personality disorders often have suicidal thoughts or threaten people in their lives with suicide. Women's borderline personality disorder number 8. BPD women frequently have ineffective, incredibly violent anger and rage, and issues with managing their frustration, rage, and violence. Chapter 10. Relationships in borderline personality disorders from a disorganized attachment perspective. Borderline personality disorder is a common psychological and relationship disorder. Some of BPD's fundamental characteristics: a history of volatile and dysfunctional interactions, repeated emotional bursts expressed in verbal abuse and anger, difficulty in regulating one's overwhelming emotions and lowering emotional regulation, intense fear of abandonment, a cognitive impairment called splits that may manifest. Splitting allows others to feel like all around or all around, depending on the underlying circumstances, making it impossible to accept all positive and negative attributes as a whole and to assign them to others. Finally, self-destructive behaviors are central to BPD to deal with the continuous and irreversible feeling of vacuum. There is growing evidence that the borderline personality disorder can be seen as a lasting damage to an individual's attachment mechanism that is deeply rooted in every single form, the one with its primary caregivers and its family. The primary BPD-related attachment types are disorganized attachment, fearful in adults, and ambivalent attachment. The main focus will be on disordered attachment in this chapter. It would be helpful at this point to refer briefly to the various styles of attachment according to the attachment theory. There are 2 main categories: a secure and unsecure connection based on the degree of safety and security in the most intimate relationships originally established by the individual's relationship with his primary caregivers. Safe attachment is characterized by feelings of security and emotional intimacy. Among adults, however, among insecure attachment, the types of attachment which can be discerned include anxious or ambivalent attachment, which is an anxious-resistant attachment in kids, anxiety-evitating attachment, which correlates to anxious-evitative attachment in kids, and fear-evitating attachment, which is disorganized attachment for kids. Adults who are comfortably linked are more self-esteem and have more positive views of their relationships and ties. They feel comfortable with their emotional intimacy while maintaining a good balance between them in their relationships. Adults with anxiety require a high level of intimacy, approval, and responsiveness from their spouses, often portrayed in the relations to be overly dependent or needy. You may have confidence issues and less optimistic feelings about yourself and your relationships. We do appear to display high levels of emotional expressivity, concern, and impulsiveness in their relationships. Discontinuous adults are diagnosed by high autonomy, as if they reject close relationships. They make themselves self-sufficient and don't need anyone around them. This pattern represents a system of defense where these adults isolate themselves from intimacy to defend themselves against rejection and harm. Fearful and avoiding adults have mixed feelings of close relationships and seek affection and awkward feelings. Just as intimidating adults, frightening, evitating adults have trouble with emotional expression and proximity. It is theorized that people with borderline personality disorders have been unable to develop a healthy relationship to their primary caregiver, as they often have been victims of psychological and other kinds of childhood abuse and neglect. When caregivers reject, cold, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable to meet the needs of their children, these caregivers are not perceived as free. Therefore, children learn to be wary, afraid, or evasive towards their parents, as their parents do not meet the emotional needs of their children. At the same time, they need support and protection from the very people they want to stop, those who may hurt them unwillingly. In adult life, this trend tends to follow a person, make it difficult, if not impossible, to feel secure in their most close, intimate relationships, those with their romantic partners. From an insecure attachment perspective, the basis is similarly established for the stormy, intimate relationship pattern that characterizes BPD, dividing love-hate with any trigger, turning from extreme idealization into extreme devaluation to its partner when their excessive fear of renunciation is activated, which can occur at any time and without any logical reasoning. All these are ways that actually reflect their uncertain attachment. Not surprisingly, BPD is very much linked with unorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment can better be built in the sense of an approach avoidance project for children who are the main source of risk both from abuse and from trauma. The need for closeness and confidentiality for the injured child continues and may increase as a result of the distress caused by the child's abuse. Emotional proximity thus becomes intolerably painful, as both are needed and avoided simultaneously. Paradoxically, the more the child comes to his caregiver, the more traumatic it is. From an early age, the BPD individual has learned to use different control techniques to maintain a security and stability basis with his parent. The same trend is introduced later on in their closest relations, thus being encountered deeply by their partners, who in effect become confused and frustrated about how to create a safety environment in their relationship when nothing seems to be sufficient to make the BPD partner feel secure. The BPD person longs desperately for love and intimacy, but eventually gets scared and far off as intimacy increases, because then their childhood schemes of approach to their abusive parents are triggered. Therefore, it can now be clearer why violent blackouts always accompany cycles of heightened intimacy in BPD's relationships. The closer they go, the more traumatic they become. Therefore, BPD people can even abandon a close relationship the further it hits their traumatic memories. That is why close relations are so turbulent and hard to maintain. The ultimate question, therefore, emerges whether the BPD individual can ever feel safe or develop a secure style of attachment in an intimate relationship. The response is not very positive, unfortunately, unless the individual makes conscious efforts and deals with these deeply rooted psychological problems. There is the misconception that BPD people can never feel safe because of their upbringing. The emotional abuse that they often experienced in their infancy makes them feel loved by their own parents and internalizes it as a way of being loved by everyone. This progressively develops to feelings of self-loathing and subsequent incapacity to fill their emotional voids. Although they have an overwhelming need for affection and attempts to be seductive and lovable, they are often so insecure and scared to be hurt if they get too close that their insecurity makes them harass their partner, which makes them feel the love they need desperately. The fact that they are often considered unlovable and their acute knowledge of this adds to their insecurity and fear and feeds a vicious cycle in which they find themselves trapped. The greatest challenge for a person with BPD is therefore to actually break the self-designed downward spiral and enjoy the pleasure of intimacy, to finally enjoy their love that they never had as children. Chapter 11. Warning.
I will stop there today. Thanks for stopping in and hanging out with me. Please do hit that like and subscribe so we can continue to learn about this borderline personality disorder, one sure disorder that is hectic for anyone. Bye-bye.